I will not be triumphed over." These were the words Cleopatra spoke before taking her own life, choosing to remain unconquered, even in death. And in a way, she succeeded. She became the most famous woman in human history. But who was she really? A cunning seductress? A victim of Roman propaganda? Or Egypt's final hope? And its greatest pharaoh? And what about the one day she believed marked a new beginning? A day that in reality became the start of her downfall? That's exactly what we'll explore in today's video. Welcome back to Female Tales. I'm Julia, and together on this channel, we explore the stories of remarkable women from history. If history speaks to you, like the video, join our community, and let's head straight into the depths of the past. Before we set off on our little journey through time, we need to clarify something. Which Cleopatra are we even talking about? Some of you might be surprised right now. Wait, what do you mean, which Cleopatra? Isn't there just the one? The lover of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony? The one from all the movies and books? Yes, that's exactly who we're talking about today. But here's the twist. She wasn't the only powerful woman in Egyptian history to bear that name. She was Cleopatra number 7. So next time you hear the name Cleopatra, maybe ask, which one? And one more thing. If you thought we were about to dive straight into the depths of ancient history, I'm afraid I have to disappoint you. But Cleopatra the 7th lived way closer to the invention of the iPhone than to the building of the pyramids. She was born in 69 BCE and died in 30 BCE. The Great Pyramid of Giza was built around 2560 BCE, and possibly even earlier. So, when it comes to time, Cleopatra was much closer to us than she was to the age of the pyramids. And by the time we enter her world, Egypt is already far from its former greatness. The country is in decline and heavily influenced by the Roman Republic. Now that I've laid the groundwork, let me invite you to finally step into our imaginary time machine and travel with me to the day that changed history, the day Cleopatra met Gaius Julius Caesar. So here we are, in Alexandria, on one of the October days of 48 BCE. This is where our story begins, and spoiler alert, where it will also end. In this very place, 12 years from now, she will face her death. But what makes this particular day so important? Well, today, 21-year-old Cleopatra is about to play one of the most dangerous political games of her life. A game where her very survival is at stake. She has to sneak into the royal palace and make her way to the chambers of Caesar to convince him to take her side in the power struggle against her own brother, who is at the same time her co-ruler and husband, Ptolemy XIII. Sounds like a decent trailer for Game of Thrones, doesn't it? After their father's death, Cleopatra and her brother were supposed to rule Egypt together. But in reality, neither of them had any intention of sharing power, and that's when Caesar decided to step in to help settle the dispute. Cleopatra knew that Julius Caesar had a certain weakness for royal women. So today, she needed to be fully armed to get what she wanted. But what exactly were Cleopatra's beauty secrets? And was she really as stunning as pop culture so often shows her? The first thing we have to say is that we actually know very little about what Cleopatra really looked like. Historians still argue, for example, about the colour of her skin. What we do know for sure is that she came from the Greek Ptolemaic dynasty, a family where close intermarriage was the norm, and there was very little room for outside genetics. So it's quite possible that she was a light-skinned Greek woman. But since we can't say for certain who her mother was, that opens the door to discussion. Most likely it was Queen Cleopatra the 5th Tryphena, but there's no solid proof of that. And honestly, when it comes to inbreeding, it's usually hard to call anyone in those families truly beautiful. Just look at the Habsburgs. Did anyone there stand out for their looks? Still, thanks to surviving Roman sculptures, coins, and a few images attributed to Cleopatra, we can form at least some kind of idea of what she might have looked like. For example, there's a painting found in Pompeii showing a woman with a prominent nose, full lips, and reddish hair. On coins, we also see that distinctive nose, a diadem in the Hellenistic style, and a hairstyle that was called the melon, which followed Roman fashion trends of the time. But while working on this video, I came across opinions in several sources that we shouldn't trust any of these images too much, because Cleopatra was actually a master of what we'd now call self-presentation. On coins, for instance, she deliberately made her profile resemble that of her father, Ptolemy XII, to emphasize political continuity. And the Roman sculptures of her weren't based on her actual features, but on the Roman beauty standards of that time. Maybe we could finally settle the question of her appearance if we had her remains. But to this day, her tomb has never been found. So if you ever come across something online with the headline, "The Real Face of Cleopatra," or some kind of facial reconstruction, just know it's pure artistic imagination. Because to create something accurate, you don't need Photoshop or artificial intelligence. You need actual genetic material. But what do you think? What did Cleopatra really look like? Do you believe she was of mixed race? Or a light-skinned Greek? Let me know in the comments. I'm genuinely curious. But beauty is a rather subjective thing. What Cleopatra really mastered was the art of presentation and making an impression. She used makeup to highlight her features. She outlined her eyes with a black kohl to give them an almond shape and applied greenish eyeshadow made from malachite and lapis lazuli. She used red ochre pigment on her lips and cheeks to give them a terracotta tone. Her nails and the palms of her hands were coloured with henna, a fashionable reddish burgundy shade at the time. Cleopatra also actively used Mendesian perfume, which was made from fragrant date oil, myrrh, cinnamon and pine resin. She was known to bathe in milk and honey so that her skin would carry a pleasant scent. Later, Greek writers even claimed that when Cleopatra arrived to meet Mark Antony, the air around her ship was filled with such a wonderful aroma that it could be smelled for miles. She also understood perfectly how to influence people through her clothing, knowing exactly where and how to make the strongest impression. For example, while living in Rome with Caesar, she often wore traditional Egyptian-style outfits to highlight her status as Queen of Egypt, and, to some extent, even influenced Roman women's fashion. She wore a head ornament called a urius, the image of a raised cobra on the forehead. While most pharaohs wore a single cobra, she used 3. After that, snakes began appearing more often in the fashion symbols of Roman women. In Egypt, she would often dress like the goddess Isis, presenting herself as a living embodiment of the deity and emphasizing the divine nature of her power. She also popularized a wardrobe element known as the knot of Isis, a draped mantle tied in a knot at the chest, resembling the robes of the goddess's priestesses. But Cleopatra's greatest weapon was not her appearance or makeup. It was what Plutarch described as sweetness in the tones of her voice and the acme of intellectual power. Despite how often Cleopatra is reduced to being just the lover of 2 famous Roman men, let's not forget who she really was. She reportedly spoke 7 or even 9 languages, and was the first in her dynasty to actually learn Egyptian in order to speak directly with her subjects. She studied oratory and philosophy under Philostratus himself. She also studied at the Mausoleum, the Temple of the Muses, where the legendary Library of Alexandria was housed. She was trained in geometry, mathematics, and astronomy. She was a skilled politician, and if we were to observe her on a typical day during her reign, she would most likely be fully immersed in the affairs of state. She organized the military, served as a judge, controlled the value of the currency, managed Egypt's economy, and provided strong support to the arts. A papyrus with her own handwritten note has even survived, reading simply, "Let it be done." So no, she wasn't planning to impress Caesar that night with just her outfit or beauty. She was meeting a man 30 years older than her, and she intended to win him over with much more than charm. But how could she possibly get into the palace when her brother husband had strictly ordered her to remain in Pelusium? Cleopatra had her own plan. First, she secretly made her way from there to Alexandria. Then, under cover of darkness, she hid inside a small boat belonging to one of her loyal followers. Here's how Plutarch described this legendary scheme.
She took a small boat and one only of her confidants, Apollodorus the Sicilian, along with her, and in the dusk of the evening landed near the palace. She was at a loss how to get in undiscovered till she thought of putting herself into the coverlet of a bed and lying at length, whilst Apollodorus tied up the bedding and carried it on his back through the gates to Caesar's apartment.
Another version of the story claims she was rolled up inside a carpet. Personally, I'm not sure which version is true. But either way, such an entrance could not have gone unnoticed. So, how did Caesar react? Once again, Plutarch gives us the answer.
Caesar was first captivated by this proof of Cleopatra's bold wit, and was afterwards so overcome by the charm of her society that he made a reconciliation between her and her brother on the condition that she should rule as his colleague in the kingdom.
But why did Caesar really agree to this alliance? Was it just her charm and one memorable night together? Or was there more behind it? Most likely, he was interested in her influence in Egypt. And Cleopatra, in turn, needed Roman military support to hold on to her throne, as well as a good relationship with Rome to maintain some form of independence from it. So, in a way, it was a win-win. Nothing personal, just political strategy on both sides. And just like that, in a single day, or rather a single night, Cleopatra changed the course of her own life. Or actually, I'd say this night changed the history of Egypt itself. Maybe I should have called this video One Night with Cleopatra. Because in 9 months, this night would have its consequences. But for now, her victory wasn't final. In the morning, after finding out what had happened, Cleopatra's 13-year-old brother husband was furious. According to sources, he threw his diadem on the floor and declared his sister a traitor to Egypt. Ptolemy laid siege to the palace where our newly formed couple was staying, and Cleopatra's younger sister, Arsinoe, declared herself queen and led a rebellion. But not long after, Caesar's reinforcements arrived, and his army claimed victory. Ptolemy met his end in the waters of the Nile, and as for her sister, Cleopatra would deal with her harshly a few years later. In June of 47 BCE, Cleopatra gave birth to Caesar's son. The boy was named Caesarion, and even though Caesar never officially acknowledged him, Cleopatra publicly emphasized his lineage in every possible way. Even the name itself was a kind of political performance. To further secure her power, she soon married her other younger brother, this time 12 years old, whom she would later also have killed. That's how the Ptolemaic family handled things. Ruthless blood ties. But all of it was part of her next political move. This time focused on her son. She likely dreamed of making him her co-ruler, and maybe even Caesar's successor, since he had no other sons. And if that plan had worked, the entire history of the Roman Republic, and maybe of the world, could have taken a completely different turn. But the Romans had their own opinion about this alliance. Even though Cleopatra was initially welcomed in Rome, and people would gather near the palace just to get a glimpse of her, she was still a foreigner and never truly popular, and no one in Rome wanted to see her, or her son, playing a role in politics. Just as no one was ready to give Caesar the one thing he wanted most, the title of Rex, king. On March 15th, 44 BCE, Julius Caesar was assassinated in a political conspiracy. Cleopatra, who was likely pregnant with his second child at the time, lost the baby and fled back to Egypt. Did she mourn him? Was their relationship truly one of love? Or was it always just about Egypt? We don't know for sure. Meanwhile, in Rome, fierce disputes broke out over who would succeed Caesar. The main contenders were Octavian, who had been officially named Caesar's heir, and the Roman general, Mark Antony, who had massive support from the army, which meant that Cleopatra now needed a new ally to protect the interests of her country. And so, she decided to bet on Mark Antony. What followed was the second most important meeting of her life, with the second most important man in her story. They already knew each other. He had seen her in Alexandria when she was just 14, but now Cleopatra clearly wanted to impress him. and to make him fall for her. And for that, she staged an entire performance. She'd carefully learned about his interests and played directly to his love of Greek culture and luxury. She arrived in Tarsus, sailing up the Cydnus River on a magnificent ship with a golden prow, purple sails, and silver oars. To the sound of music, Cleopatra reclined beneath a canopy embroidered with gold, dressed as Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love. The impression Cleopatra made must have been truly extraordinary. Mark Antony, 13 years older than her, fell for her like a schoolboy, and so began their turbulent 10-year romance. They had 3 children together, and for a while, it seemed that Cleopatra had finally gotten everything she wanted. Her kingdom, her freedom, and love. But Octavian remained a constant threat to them both. So Mark Antony married Octavian's sister, Octavia, in an attempt to form an alliance. Still, Octavian had his eyes on absolute power. And Antony's lifestyle, and especially his involvement with an Egyptian queen, didn't fit Rome's moral image. Octavian used this to his advantage, working hard to portray Cleopatra as a shameless, dangerous seductress. And it was around this time that her infamous image, the one that would be cemented in literature and history, truly began to form. The poet Horace, writing in the late 1st century BC, called her a crazy queen plotting to demolish the capital and topple the Roman Empire. And yet in reality, Cleopatra only had 2 men in her life. By today's standards, she was practically a virgin. This long-standing rivalry eventually led to open war. A war that Octavian framed as a moral crusade against the depraved Egyptian queen who had ensnared Mark Antony. The armies of Rome's 2 rivals met in Greece, where in 31 BCE, around 900 ships clashed in the Battle of Actium. It was a fierce and hard-fought battle. But in the end, it ended in defeat for the lovers. Cleopatra's fleet turned and fled, and Antony followed, abandoning his army. The 2 of them found themselves trapped on land, while Octavian's forces closed in and many of Antony's former allies deserted him. For them, everything was lost. And so we find ourselves once again in Alexandria, but this time on the final and most decisive day of Cleopatra's life, August 12th, 30 BCE. A day that would once again show us just how brave and unbreakable this woman truly was. On the 1st of August, as Alexandria fell, Mark Antony received a message that Cleopatra had taken her own life. In despair, he threw himself on his sword, but in reality, the queen was still alive, hiding in her sanctuary. When she learned what had happened, she ordered that the dying Antony be brought to her, and he died in her arms that same evening. Her children were taken as hostages by Octavian, and Cleopatra herself was now his prisoner. She looked him in the eye and said, "I will not be led in a triumph." She refused to be paraded through the streets of Rome like a trophy. Just as she had been the mistress of her life, she chose to be the mistress of her death. On August 12th, according to some sources, she allowed a venomous snake to bite her. Others claim she used poison hidden in a hairpin, something she had prepared in advance. She was 39 years old. When the Romans burst into the room, one of her handmaidens, Charmian, was still alive, and she is said to have uttered these words, "It is well done, and fitting for a princess descended of so many royal kings." And so ended the story of the last pharaoh of Egypt. With her, a 275-year reign of the Ptolemies came to an end. Egypt lost its independence and became a Roman province. Cleopatra, a woman who, even in defeat, refused to be forgotten. She lived boldly, ruled fiercely, and chose her own ending. And now I want to hear from you. Who was she really? Seductress, savior, strategist? Maybe all of it and more. Who is Cleopatra to you? Let me know in the comments. And I'll see you in the next video.